one more question before we hear from the investors. What were the hardest? What was the hardest part about putting together a deal with an investor? What were the kind of sticky negotiation points that you encountered?
It was a good negotiation. Just at one point, which was kind of interesting, we have a one-page sheet with the main things, no major problem. And at some point, we're in a meeting and we have like a new clause that says, we can fire you. I have been working for 20 years for this company, putting all my life in this company, and that clause was kind of strange. So I called one of the partners, my wife. So I called my wife and say, we have one new clause that says that they can fire us. My wife just laughed. She said, okay, no problem. If they fire us, it will be their problem, not will be our problems. So I think that was you have to do a click. When you go to an investors, the investors have certain things that the reason that they are putting the money in your company. In 5 years, they wanted to sell. They need to sell. So if you understand what their business, and you agree that you want to play those rules, and you understand them very well, where you're getting to, if they are fair, it's fair for both sides.
Great. So Michael, you do angel investing, so early stage investing in Brazil. And I imagine you encounter some of the concerns Raul just brought up frequently. And what's your response?
It can be challenging when you're working, especially at an angel level. You're working traditionally with entrepreneurs they're not serial entrepreneurs. It's usually their first time, and so they don't. There's a huge sort of misunderstanding about what can happen and what should happen in terms of raising capital. I try and structure things so that there's an incentive that, if things go well, they do well, and we both do well. Because otherwise, it can get very challenging with them because they look at this long list of terms and they're like, oh my God, if I sign this, I don't have a lawyer. I've never gone through the whole process of working with lawyers before. So as an angel, I usually focus things on saying, look, once I start getting my money back, the sky's the limit for you. We're going to build this thing together. But we're going to share the risk. But initially, I want to see my investment back. And once that happens, so you start out with a very low percentage. But once my basic investment is recovered, then I'm happy to become a minority shareholder at some point. I want to see that person grow the business, and the more successful they are, the less of the company I need or want.
Mm-hmm. That's good. And so, why do you invest in Brazil? What do you see as the biggest opportunity here?
I think initially it was having traveled down here and seeing the pool of talent. Having worked in New York, and during the 1.0 bubble, we saw that there was a scarcity of developers of managed projects, which did a lot of outsourcing to Eastern Europe or to India. And the Brazilian developers showed up consistently as being really top-notch developers. Outsourcing to India is cost effective, but we never got a lot of creativity back. They give you exactly what you send to them. Whereas working with some of the Brazilian developers, we were getting really fabulous input and feedback and pushback on the product, and saying, no, you guys should do it like this, you should change this, And as long as you're open to that and your time schedule is good, it's a very valuable thing. So that caught my eye. And once I learned a little bit more about the ecosystem, I realized that there was no one investing in the very early stage, in the seed stage, which meant it's sort of wide open for opportunities here.
Good. So now, John, you put together a very unique deal, and maybe you could just walk us through what that process was like, and in particular the relationship with the entrepreneur.
Yeah, I was thinking, he went through sort of a whole transformation over the course of 12 months in terms of coming to grips with, ultimately what was going to be his ownership in the company post this round of financing, what his rights were going to be and what minority rights he was giving up to the two families that were coming in, and how the board was going to work, and could he be fired, all the same, and so you could see this all kind of flashing through his mind over the course of 12 months, and so and even though this wasn't intentional, I ended up sort of playing the role of a little bit of intermediator between the capital coming in and him. And know, it was a series of phases. You know, the first phase was, you know, he started off, he had 55% of the company because, you know, the IT guy and actually his wife-to-be, and she wasn't, they weren't married at the time, had the rest along with some others. And so, you know, he just walked into this assuming that somehow, miraculously, he was still going to end up, you know, 51% of the company, which, you know, just was never really going to work. But, you know, we didn't sort of confront it immediately until, you know, the hard numbers started, you know, appearing. And it wasn't just from, you know, the deal we were cutting. I mean, we did go through the VC community. I didn't participate personally in a lot of the meetings, but Andres, the CEO, did go to Boston and Silicon Valley and so on. And actually, we got a good reception. You know, I don't know how those would have played out, but, you know, we got traction with these families. But in any case, you know, he suddenly started realizing, you know, I'm going to end up with maybe a quarter of this company. And that was a real hard thing for him to get his mind around. But, you know, he finally did. You know, he realized that, obviously you got to have a lot of confidence the company's going to go so quickly that you know, your wealth is going to, you know, more than catch up for what you seemingly have lost on paper, and it'll all work out fine. And then the second phase, you know, when we started getting into the term sheet, and you know, the investor capital was coming in the form of preferred stock, okay, to protect them, and obviously the founder and his group's going to stay in common stock. And so the terms, you know, started being put on the table in terms of the minority rights, you know, things like liquidation preference and dilution protection, all this very technical stuff. But, you know, it all of a sudden, it's cumulative. I mean, it really starts, you know, he was going, I guarantee he was not getting a lot of sleep many nights thinking about the scenarios in which, you know, scenarios where the company doesn't necessarily take off, it sort of does okay, but he basically, you know, ends up losing the company, you know, anyway. So again, as I ended up in this role, in this you know, chairman role, trying to, you know, hold his hand and comfort him through the process, at the same time trying to get the deal done, you know, with the capital coming in. So it was a pretty interesting experience, and not an easy one. And as I say, it really took about 9 months, you know, to get to this closing round. But anyway, that's sort of my answer to the question about how, you know, the perception I had of seeing how the various mindset changes over time. That, you know, you just have to come to grips with the fact that this capital has a lot of strings attached, and it's got to be a good deal for both sides. And these people are taking, you know, a lot of risk, whatever it may be. Well, I'll stop there.
Right. Well, so just one follow-up question. So it sounds like you played this kind of mediary role between the investors and the entrepreneurs. Who were the investors, and how did that factor into this dynamic?
Yeah, it requires a little bit of background explanation. The two families, the Salaverrias and the Acerskis, are two fairly prominent families in El Salvador who own various media assets. They own the largest direct marketing company in Central America. They have 40-odd retail stores spread across Central America. They own cable TV, broadcast TV, all kinds of things. So this gets into a little bit of their motivation for doing this deal. I had a connection to them that was a little bit sort of out of the blue. Well, the son of one of the families used to work for me at Nexstar, the fund in New York. So that was the original connection. But their motivation was twofold. On the one hand, you know, because they're not VCs by nature, they're running their businesses right across the region.